Happy 2017, Gothamites. Welcome to another episode of the Arkham Sessions. This is the first episode of the Arkham Sessions of the new year. We want to welcome everyone, especially my co-host, the superhero psychologist, the psychologist.
You've forgotten.
It's been a long time. I gotta tell you, you are the psychologist to the superheroes, the superheroines, and the supervillains of Gotham City and beyond. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
Hi, Brian.
Hi. I am very excited to be here. On top of that, I'm very excited to be healthy. Over the holidays, you got sick, then I got sick.
Your voice is slightly...
Sick?
I was just going to say, just a little bit on the scratchy...
Yeah.
Side, but your voice is normally a little bit on the scratchy.
Now I can be a little more like Batman.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got sick and I got sick and then you got sick again and then I got sick again. And now we're finally able to sit down and discuss an episode that we were going to discuss a while back. Last week, we posted on the Arkham Sessions Twitter account a tease that as long as you could do to your cold what Batman was doing to a thug, which was
the old from the behind punch.
Yeah, the blind backhanded punch over the shoulder. Then we would be recording the episode, and then that day, literally, you got even sicker, and then I got sick. It was as if Batman in that photo were actually the cold and you and I were the thug.
Yeah.
So we're very happy to be here. For starters, how were your holidays? I hear you got a pretty cool gift on Christmas Day.
Let me think about that.
Maybe a couple of them.
I got a couple of cool things. I did get the Batman animated series VR set, which is really great. It's essentially a VR headset that you can put your smartphone into, and then you download a program, and it's really cool. It's definitely what I would consider a in line with what I would expect VR to look like from that perspective of, being able to see it from your phone. And as far as the animated series goes, it's great. It's interactive. You can look at various models and objects and data and evidence in the Batcave. You can do all sorts of things. There's other characters. It's really cool. So if you can find it online, it was a gift, so I don't know where to go.
Well, here's the thing. It's from Viewmaster, and it's done as goggles. It's a new Viewmaster done in the same sort of style that we're accustomed to, where it's got the little disc. Only in this case, the disc has a little QR code that you can scan.
Oh, you're getting so technical about it.
Well, it's very cool. The other cool thing about it is, in the old Viewmaster, where you would actually use your finger to switch from one picture to the next.
Sure.
That will take you from one place from the Batcave to another, and whatever. It's very, very cool. It's from Viewmaster. You should check it out. It's the Batman the Animated Series VR, something that you didn't say, mainly because we haven't been able to play with it too much, is that it's not just a tour of the Batcave. These are legitimate new adventures. And because they are new adventures that take place within the Batman the Animated Series universe, they, of course, star Kevin Conroy, Lauren Lester came back, Mark Hamill came back, Tara Strong came back, and more. So we're going to dive in one of these days and maybe even see what you have to say about the fact that Batman has let some rando with a Viewmaster VR headset come into the Batcave. My holidays were fantastic. Part of my holidays were being able to watch this episode coming up a couple of times because I watched it once when I needed to pull our, extensive audio clips, the things we use to illustrate our points, and sometimes mess with Drea. And then I got to watch it again because when I got sick, I completely forgot what this episode was about. And had to rewatch the whole thing.
Well, it is called Double Talk, so
it is.
Everyone should see it twice.
Yeah, maybe we'll talk about it twice.
And who's not in it is Two-Face, which is kind of weird.
It is a little weird until you start to think about who is in it. But before we get to that, Drea, we did get a couple of emails over the holidays over at our Arkham Sessions at gmail.com. This one is from Abdul. Good day, Dr. Letamendi. I want to start by first thanking you and praising you for your work.
Thank you,
Signed,
Abdul.
Abdul. That's it. Oh, there's more. I've only recently stumbled on the Arkham Sessions, and I'm already at episode 42. Thank you, sir. We appreciate that. My question today relates to the experiences of trauma. This is something you're going to be good at, Drea. And the response of self-medication. One often reads about how the experience of trauma can have some very far-reaching consequences, like the development or worsening of certain mental disorders. However, this can also lead down the path of self-medication and addiction. I myself have witnessed two close friends go down that path after experiencing hardship/traumatic events. What I've always wondered, however, is if the relative age can affect the outcome. For example, if one experiences trauma at age 5 or 15, can both yield the same results? Is one more likely to become an addict than the other? Or is one more likely to develop mental illness than the other? And since you are the psychologist to the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains, see, he remembered, but I had trouble. If one take Bruce Wayne as a case study, can someone of his position, intelligence, influence, and support go down the path of self-medication and possibly addiction after experiencing a trauma such as his? If so, then when is that most likely to occur? Thank you so much for all you've done. Much love and support to your work, Abdul. That's a pretty loaded question, but this is actually a topic that you and I have discussed many times, both on the show and certainly on our panels. The idea of trauma and young people experiencing trauma versus older folks, and first-time trauma versus repeated trauma. Drea, what do you have to say about that?
I love this question. This is such an insightful question, and I think could be relevant for just about anybody. And one of the reasons is that trauma itself is actually very commonplace. The statistics and the prevalence rates around the experience of trauma are pretty much consistent around the idea that you are more likely to experience a traumatic event in your lifetime than not. Up to about 2/3 of individuals will experience some kind of traumatic event by the age of 18 to 24. So that question introduces, and I think really lays a foundation for the commonality of a traumatic experience.
Now, again, as you've done in the past, let's clarify. A traumatic event is not necessarily, oh my God, we're wearing the same outfit at this very important occasion. I'm so embarrassed. I'm traumatized.
Right. I'm stuck on the freeway in traffic. I'm waiting in line at Starbucks. I can't get my Comic-Con pass. I'm stuck in the wait list, or what are they, the holding, whatever that is online. Those are difficult experiences. Those are stressful experiences, but they're not traumatic experiences. So I appreciate that you're bringing up even the concept of trauma has become kind of diluted and misused a bit. But having said that, The question that's introduced here is really around the development of mental health problems as a result of the experience of trauma. When it comes to PTSD, for instance, which is probably the most understood reaction after a traumatic experience, you're going to see some relatively low prevalence rates compared to how many how common trauma itself is. So a fraction of folks who experience a traumatic event are actually going to develop PTSD as a result.
And is PTSD, just for clarification, is PTSD the only thing that someone can expect to develop after a traumatic event? His question was sort of about mental illness and disorders, and are there other things that could happen as a result of trauma?
Absolutely.
Or is it okay?
Absolutely. I like that he uses words like hardships, and I would add in adversity, because when we think about the impact of trauma, we have to consider a complex and even a developmental perspective around this. And I love that he introduces the idea of what would be the difference between childhood trauma versus adolescent trauma versus, teenage or young adult age experiences of trauma. And I would even extend that to consider what would it be like to experience a trauma in adulthood after you've been protected from traumatic experiences, let's say. So there's not an easy or straightforward answer around this, because so many factors and variables are in play. So what I would rather do than just answer that particular scenario is just sort of explore the idea that this formula that we're looking at, if I can simplify things a little bit, involves risk factors and resiliency factors. And those, or I would say the combination of those risk and resiliency factors would work together or would contribute to the development of a mental health disorder or PTSD. When I say risk factors, those are psychological vulnerabilities. They can also be biological or medical vulnerabilities. So if you are already experiencing a medical disorder, or if you are already feeling depressed or down and you experience a traumatic event, for instance, that may increase your likelihood of developing a mental health disorder. Those are simplified examples, but does that make sense? Like there's a vulnerability, there's a risk factor.
Sure.
And certainly things like neglect, lack of consistent parenting, poverty, personal hardships, and low social support would be factors to take into consideration. On the other end, you have resiliency factors. So those are like protective factors that will keep your risk or contribute to the likelihood that you will overcome that traumatic event or not develop a mental health problem. And those resiliency factors, you just think of the opposite of those risk factors for the most part, right? Having a lot of social support, having solid, consistent, and supportive parenting or caregiving in your early childhood years, having a level of socioeconomic status that does not introduce hardships to you. You have the basic needs met, right? Shelter, food, water, those kinds of things. So it really is a biological, emotional, and environmental combination of factors that will impact your likelihood of developing a mental health problem following a trauma. And so what I often say is that it's really not in our control, nor should it be a goal for us to completely avoid traumatic experiences.
Right.
I don't wish them upon anyone, but to better understand and to think of our approach of improving or working toward those protective factors and reducing, if possible, those risk factors.
And what about, he mentions specifically addiction and self-medication, he asks about Bruce and would someone like Bruce, who's got all the resources that he has, is it possible for him to do things like self-medicate? For starters, I would argue that he's already self-medicating just by putting on the costume every single night and going out there and pummeling bad guys. Right. I think that is his way of doing.
When I understand or interpret the phrase self-medicating, I believe that generally means maladaptive coping, right? So yeah, I think that it's very possible that he's had instances where he's engaging in maladaptive coping because he's not getting his social support. He's not confiding in a partner. He's not exercising trust and loyalty to others. He's very defensive at times. Is he engaging in addictions? I don't know. I think that he's addicted to adrenaline, which is a thing in the sense of like seeking an environment, seeking situations and interactions that would provoke him or would increase adrenaline. I think that's certainly a possibility for him.
Right.
But you don't need a traumatic experience to do that.
Right. Yeah. You don't need something really horrible to spawn that kind of addiction or that kind of, need, whether it be drugs and alcohol or adrenaline or whatever.
Right.
Good answers. Good answers. In fact, I think part of that is actually going to fuel our conversation today. Let's jump into the episode. Double Talk. For starters, this is the fourth episode of the new Batman adventures that we've covered. Drea, what are you liking and even disliking about this new incarnation of Batman so far as we wade into these episodes?
I think I'm pleased with the consistency of the narratives and the characters. I mean, there are some things that are missing, but for the most part, like we're going to talk about some characters in this episode that have not changed tremendously, but have certainly experienced an arc, and I think that it fits fine with their history. I appreciate that there's still a level of depth, that there's a darkness to it in both the animation and in the storytelling. Right. I think that's still there. I was worried that it would lift a bit, but I don't think it has.
No,
what do you think?
I don't think it has at all. In fact, I think I'm actually appreciating these stories a little bit because I feel like we're getting a little more with the villains, a little more with even the sidekicks than we are with Batman in these episodes. I'm feeling like the episodes themselves are more about other people than they are specifically about Bruce or Robin or even Alfred. And so I appreciate being able to spend more time with some of these characters. This one in particular, we start out at Arkham Asylum. And Arnold Wesker. If you don't remember Arnold Wesker, you would certainly remember his counterpart, a little mobster made of wood by the name of Scarface. Arnold Wesker is, of course, the ventriloquist.
And Arnold is a very mild-mannered, petite,
meek.
Yeah,
in fact, not even mild-mannered. He's quite nervous.
He's bespectacled.
Certainly not someone you would expect to be a criminal mastermind. Some people would suggest that he had multiple personalities, that of Arnold Wesker / the ventriloquist, and then that of Scarface, his ventriloquist figure. You, of course, have poo-pooed that. You have said, no, you can't interact this way between your two different personalities in the past. You've said no.
I thought that the more likely situation or scenario here is that he is utilizing the inanimate object to fulfill some of his more aggressive, violent wishes.
It's a totem.
Yeah. And so by giving it a voice, by giving it a personality, by even having it push him around, he's kind of like playing around and exercising with some of the aspects of his own personality, not dividing into two personalities,
right.
Which is, you said multiple personality disorder. The current category or label for that disorder is dissociative identity disorder. And there's very little evidence for that description to be a mental health experience, or a psychiatric condition, so to speak.
Right.
So the more likely scenario is an exploration of his own individual identity by utilizing this inanimate object.
Right. So I have to ask, as a clinical psychologist, if you've got a patient like this, even though he is one half of a criminal mastermind, would he go to Arkham Asylum, or would he go to...
I think if anybody, he would go to Arkham Asylum.
Okay, so now my next question is...
You're saying he wouldn't go to Blackgate.
Blackgate / Stonegate, whichever the animated series uses. So you would stick him in the hospital.
Right.
So, okay, then that leads me to my next question. At what point does someone who is criminal, someone like Arnold Wesker, whether he, was just an unwitting accomplice to this wood figure or not, he is still partaken in these crimes, this criminal activity. So at what point in time does that kind of person get out of Arkham Asylum? Because at the very beginning of this episode, they are releasing him. And I found that to be, I know you and I have discussed the leniency of Arkham Asylum in the past. But take a listen to this, because this to me is a little concerning.
You've been healthy for 6 months, Arnold. That's good enough for the state, and it should be good enough for you too. As long as you maintain a clean break from your past, I'm sure your alternate personality will remain suppressed.
Well, that's what I would have said.
6 months? 6 months. I mean, he was a criminal figure in Gotham City, and after only 6 months of no Scarface identity, which presumably he would need the figure anyway, right? He would need the ventriloquist figure. So as long as he doesn't have one, you could probably... But is 6 months enough time to say you're healthy enough? And what's troubling to me is the fact that she specifically says it's good enough for the state. It should be good enough for you too, which, if you remember correctly, is identical to what they told Harvey.
I have I don't have the ability to defend the system here, because I didn't contribute to these policies, and they do not reflect anything outside of the fictional Gotham world. I think that one of the challenges for me, though, is that clearly they're going down the path, or they're his clinical team, his treatment team, has decided that he does have an alternate personality, and that they have not seen it emerge in a period of time. And because of that, they deem him healthy enough to be released into the community. And so I can't really disagree or agree with that, because I don't actually think he has an alternate personality. I think that he has a fragmented sense of self. I think that he would have benefited from psychotherapy, and certainly could be fine to be released into the community. But I wouldn't release him for the same, my justification would be different.
Right.
And so I agree with you, though, that without the articulation of Scarface, he's in a way unable to access that part of his personality. So I believe, consistent with previous episodes, as long as he's not, as long as he doesn't have access to Scarface, or any like little doll thing, then he should be good to go.
Yeah. Now, of course, we've seen him at the end of the episode with Catwoman, and in fact, we saw him in woodshop carving a new Scarface. So he's almost got this compulsion to let that personality out. In this case, we actually see that Arnold legitimately wants to be free of this personality, which or this outlet, which I'm very pleased with. I love seeing characters that are legitimately trying to reform, and Arnold appears to be legitimately trying to reform.
Exactly. Arnold does not want to harm others. He does not want to harm himself. He wants to integrate into the community, and he's showing a lot of signs of being motivated to stay on that path and to rehabilitate. So I agree with you.
Well, as he is leaving his cell, he is being followed by a familiar trunk. With that trunk comes a familiar voice, and that is none other than Scarface himself. And we get to see this nightmarish image as Batman comes in trying to help, and Scarface comes in with his Tommy gun, and he actually jumps on top of Wesker's chest and just begins, shooting away his Tommy gun. He's crazed, and suddenly Wesker wakes up. Clearly, he is anxiety-ridden. He feels something coming, and he's terrified.
I actually really like this part of the episode because you don't actually see Scarface for a period of time. You are seeing Arnold Wesker essentially experience the remnants, the triggers, the haunting memories of Scarface. And so there's I think a wonderful series of moments where he has his intrusive first he has the nightmare and he has these intrusive thoughts. He has some flashbacks. He is seeing Scarface in places that he's not. So these aren't hallucinations. These are essentially trauma reminders. These are triggers.
Yeah.
And I think that it's a wonderful, I just love that it unfolds. It's a wonderful series of, this is going to make me sound weird, but a wonderful series of ways that Arnold is being haunted and increasingly becoming miserable and anxious and hypervigilant in a way that I think is strangely realistic, and it fills my heart in the most bizarre way, because you see how he's somewhat optimistic. He's released from the hospital. He's ready to go. And then here are these memories that are impacting his functioning. He can't walk in the park without seeing someone on a bench with a ventriloquist dummy, which, by the way, there is. That's kind of a weird thing to see in a park. But he sees that, and it causes him to feel anxious and to experience heart palpitations and sweating and ruminations and intrusive thoughts. He gets into bed. He has these nightmares. So all of this, I think, is, it's difficult to see, but I think it's very realistic.
Well, and let me bring this back to Abdul's question, because to me, this almost also seems like an addict dealing with the struggle of one day at a time. He is terrified of, very much like an alcoholic having just gotten out of rehab. You've got to keep going and doing the steps. You've got to keep going one day without picking up a bottle. Meanwhile, you could go to a party and see someone drinking a glass of wine, and it could desperately, it could make you anxious, and you could suddenly not only want the bottle, but you could be fearful that you're going to pick up the bottle. I mean, I've known addicts who have said that it's not that they miss the thing that they had. Sometimes it's the anxiety that they won't be able to stop themselves from picking up the thing that they had. Like, they don't want to be held by the addiction. And to me, seeing Wesker in this particular setting where you can see that he desperately doesn't want to have Scarface as part of his identity, but he's terrified that he won't be able to hold him back. That to me seemed a little like an addict as well.
Right. I see what you're saying. There's this sense of dependency
Yes.
on something, and the vulnerability when one is I guess susceptible to use
Yes.
to use that thing or to use that that thing that makes you sick.
Right.
And I don't disagree with that. I think that's a good analogy. I think that, you know, again, what's worthwhile about the first third of this episode is the just the different scenarios and examples of stressors. And I think that is those are lessons to learn, right? He even hears the voice, and I think that's another great moment where we even wonder. This is why it's cool, because we don't see Scarface yet. So we're thinking, is this a product of his mind? Is he having auditory hallucinations? Has he gone so far down, you know, the level of severity in his mental state that he's now hearing these voices, and he is really questioning his own reality.
Right. And before he starts to physically hear that voice, I mean, he does in the nightmare, of course, but before he starts to physically hear that voice of Scarface, we get to see him at work, which is kind of cool. And this is something that you and I have discussed before, where I have said, rather than dressing up as Batman and going out every night and pummeling bad guys and throwing them in prison in Arkham Asylum, and they're just going to get out, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I always thought Bruce Wayne would be better off as a philanthropist, as someone who, like with Harvey Dent, was willing to pay for the surgery to make Harvey whole again, and was willing to do that. We see,
and like with Mr. Freeze, where Wayne Industries essentially funded Nora's treatment and recovery.
And Batman offered to help. You know, he said that he would hook him up with Bruce Wayne, who could help him, continue his work. And it was always as Batman that Mr. Freeze would get angry, or that all these other characters would get angry. The character of Batman is not the one you want rationally trying to argue with the bad guys, because the image of that character is just going to set them off. They're going to want to commit crime and beat him up or kill him or whatever. Bruce Wayne, on the other hand, might actually do some good. Here we see that he has given Arnold a place at his halfway house. He has given him a job at Wayne Enterprises. And I feel like this is where Bruce is at his best, and where he could really do a great deal of work, because he sees that Arnold is, he's got the job, he's thankful for the job, and Bruce comes up and shakes his hand and lets him know that he's being supportive. And I loved seeing that scene, because it just reminds me of Oswald wanting to go straight, but no one giving him the chance. And if Bruce had just given him a chance instead of tailing him around, it might have worked out. I just enjoyed seeing that moment.
I agree with that, but the problem is that Batman also has his addiction.
Right.
So it's not sufficient for him. He's also quite paranoid, so he has to follow him in the night with his binoculars and, wait in the tree and all those things that we make fun of him for.
Sure. And he does that with Arnold. But what I think is interesting about the way that he does it with Arnold is he's not doing it in order to catch Arnold doing something. He almost seems to be doing it in a Big Brother I don't mean a Orwellian Big Brother sort of way, but I mean like he's
taking him under his wing.
Yeah.
And I think even this is one of the characters that I would assert that Batman is, or Bruce Wayne is not necessarily pessimistic about. Does that make sense? Like he's not, I don't think that he's anticipating that Arnold is going to mess up here.
Yeah.
I think that he truly believes Arnold deep down inside is a good person. And
do you think that's because of the past experiences where Arnold has specifically begged Batman not to interfere, or he has shown that he's almost as much a victim as any one of Scarface's victims?
I think that one of the products or outcomes of him developing Scarface is that we are splitting too. We really love and feel sorry for and want to help Arnold, and we villainize and hate and despise Scarface, and we want him to go away.
Right.
So he has created a duality that we're giving into, and I think that Bruce Wayne is giving into, and that he is focusing all of his negative energy and persecution toward toward Scarface, and not toward Arnold.
Yeah. Arnold, of course, is on his way back home one night when he comes across two old allies, Rhino and Muggsy. Of course, we know them as having been the two hench folk for Scarface. And they come along wanting to know exactly when the boss is coming back. Arnold insists that he is not, in fact, coming back. And as we mentioned, Batman steps in and fights them off. He basically says, "You leave Arnold Wesker alone." And I really enjoyed seeing Batman, rather than sit up on some tall building somewhere watching for a teenage kid mugging an old lady, I liked him taking a specific approach toward rehabilitation and making sure that a character continued to do well. That was very important to me, but unfortunately, this seemed to trigger something, that anxiety that Wesker already had. And when he got home, he began to hear a very familiar, terrifying voice.
What's the matter, dummy? Having a bad day?
Huh? Who's there?
Thought you could get rid of me, huh? Pull some sort of psychobabble snuff job.
No.
Well, I'm coming back, and I got a score to settle with you.
No, please, it can't be.
Nobody pushes Scarface around.
I feel so bad for him.
I know, he snaps.
He doesn't snap, Brian.
He breaks.
No, he doesn't.
I don't mean psychologically. I mean, it drives him to the point that he yells, "No!" Like, I mean,
he's distressed.
He is absolutely
But anybody
distressed.
would be in that situation.
I'm not blaming him for it, but it does appear to be a little bit of a breaking point. Later, he goes to work and he finds a letter in the mail. Because he's a mail clerk. He finds a letter that basically says, "Hey dummy," like it's basically for him. And when he goes back home that night, he receives a phone call, and the phone call comes from Scarface, which is kind of weird.
Well, and even here, so we see him on the phone and we hear Scarface on the other line. So we don't see Scarface. And even in this moment, I thought to myself, this could still be a product of his own mind, like an auditory hallucination.
Sure.
I'm not saying he's throwing his voice like a ventriloquist and creating this sound.
Right.
I'm saying in his mind, he has... he's experiencing an auditory hallucination, and his insight is so poor that he believes that this this ventriloquist dummy is communicating with him through a telephone, which is not bizarre,
right?
Or not as bizarre as it sounds, because that is that could be an experience that someone with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, for instance, that would be
something they might experience.
That would, yeah.
And it's a creepy conversation too, and one that is very, like you said, you are rooting for him. You see Scarface as an antagonist on the other end of the line. Take a listen.
But you're gone. I'm cured.
Cured? I ain't a case of the sniffles, dummy. And I don't roll over just 'cause some quack waves a $2 watch at me. Nobody pulls my strings, dummy. Especially not you.
Now, something that obviously makes you perk up a little bit is when we cut back to Batman and he's got the phones tapped and he hears the voice too.
So he hears Scarface.
Yeah, he hears Scarface. And he looks over at the nearby telephone booth, and there is the creepiest little dummy sitting on the phone. You just see the silhouette of the little doll, and
he's so small.
He's so small, and so Batman is now hearing this other voice. So how could that possibly be? Batman ends up chasing down the little doll. The doll actually fights back. And it's a very action-packed scene. I mean, for starters, Batman nearly gets killed because Scarface ends up dropping, a ton of statues, and it nearly kills him. But Scarface gets away. Bruce, or Batman, has an idea.
Clearly someone's trying to drive Wesker mad.
Oh.
Yeah, like it's not Wesker. Wesker is so anxious. He thinks that this voice is coming back, but Batman knows that it can't possibly be him. Wesker gets away from all of this, goes back home, and sadly finds Scarface right there, waiting on his couch, and he has to pick him up, but not before Scarface gets a little dig in.
How long are you gonna stand there and stare? Give me a ballpark so I can plan my day. Pick me up already!
And that's when it happens. Wesker picks him up, and now he's complete. Scarface is back, and Batman and Batgirl have to put an end to this. They end up going and tracking down the one person that Batman feels might have something to do with the little ventriloquist doll, and that is a little person by the name of Hips McManus. And Hips McManus explains that he was hired simply to put on the costume to help trigger Arnold Wesker, and that's all he had to do with it. And, although Batman sort of lets him off, but if we really want to talk about, that means Hips McManus is the one that almost killed Batman.
Yeah.
I think Hips should be going to the joint as well. No? But Batman is more concerned about Arnold than he is Hips.
Well, Hips was hired to F around with this guy. Arnold is the one who has, I don't know, would you say that he's slipped back into his condition, that he's experiencing an episode, or I think that Batman's more concerned about his condition.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
It's almost as if he's relapsed.
Yeah. Well, and Hips explains where they can find
he
Scarface.
gives him info.
He tells him that he could go to Wayne Enterprises, and there Scarface has taken Lucius Fox hostage. and gets Lucius to open up a vault, which Batman and Batgirl end up, stopping them at the vault. But then Batman and Batgirl end up getting caught inside the vault. And once again, Batman proves that he's really good at falling into traps. You almost find yourself wondering if he does it on purpose so that he can get himself out of them. While Batman and Batgirl are trying to figure out a way out of the vault with a bomb, Scarface really let Rhino and Muggsy have it.
You thought you could decide when I was coming out? You could have ruined my plan.
What plan?
I was playing possum, laying low till the heat was off.
If this is a mental disorder, is that something that can happen? Like, can you basically?
Well, no, okay. Let's break down what Scarface is saying. Scarface is saying that he was messing with the messies.
Right.
Like he was saying that, oh no, you didn't
messing with the messers.
Yeah. The messy. I thought it was the messy.
Start yapping, Foxy. Open the hen house.
He is the one who is playing the thugs. Mm-hmm. That this entire time.
No, not the thugs. He's the one playing the doctors and playing Wesker.
Everybody.
Yeah, he's playing everybody.
Well, because the thugs think that they're manipulating Wesker to reanimate Scarface, right? Yeah. So they believe that they are hiring the guy, and Hips comes in and he pretends that he all that. The reality that Scarface is asserting is that he was laying low and playing possum, meaning he's pretending that he's not.
He's
alive.
Allowed Arnold to think that for the last 6 months he's been cured, yes, when really he's just been laying low.
Yes. And I agree with you that extends past this one incident, that this is while Arnold is in treatment. Mm-hmm. And that this entire time he's waiting for the right moment to reunite with Arnold and become the duo, because he needs Arnold to physically function.
And they almost messed everything up by taking it upon themselves to initiate the boss's return.
Right.
Because they didn't know that he had this plan all along.
Right. And so do we believe that Scarface is an actual individual, that he has cognitive capacity, that he's sentient, like all these things that I'm not sure what at the end of the day the episode or the writers are having us to believe.
Right.
And in the psychological interpretation, this is all part of Arnold Wesker's I guess justification or rationale for how all of this happened. Because again, if this is an extension of a particular part of his personality, not a separate personality, a particular part of his personality, that's how he's sort of justifying Scarface coming back to life and partaking in this crime.
Yeah. So once again, we come down to a climactic ending where Batman and Batgirl get out of the vault. They have to rescue Muggsy and Rhino from being killed by Scarface. And Batman specifically tries to reason with Wesker, explaining that the puppet is just a puppet.
That's what I'm saying.
But again,
the puppet is not controlling him. He's controlling the puppet.
Yeah. Do you want Batman to be the one to be telling you that?
Yes, because I think that's why this writing is great, because the characterization of Scarface is around the idea that this is an exaggerated and of course a fictional narrative where a whole villain is created out of this dynamic, but really this is about a person trying to get a handle on their violence and on their aggression to the degree that it's playing out in this characterization of Scarface.
So you think Wesker is willing to let go of Scarface by embracing another dark, menacing character like Batman, and allowing Batman to tell him to let go of Scarface, similar to the way Scarface would tell him to. I mean, whatever it is he does, it ends up working because Wesker then takes the gun and begins shooting Scarface. Like Wesker, for the first time, we see Wesker murder his alter ego, not Catwoman or some other, accident that takes the dummy down. Wesker takes that step for himself. It's a very powerful moment.
Yeah, I think it's great.
He doesn't end up going back to Arkham, though. He doesn't go back to prison. Instead, he goes back home, comforted by this idea that he has conquered this demon. And there he meets his landlord / the manager of the apartments that is run by Bruce, or owned by Bruce, but I guess run by her. She's another little person. Like the episode almost has a lot of red herrings, like, oh, it could have been her,
right.
Those running around, but it wasn't. It was Hips McManus. But it also sort of sets up this weird dynamic that Arnold can only surround himself with.
Yeah, I wonder why they did that, because that would trigger him.
Yeah. But she says that this now gives him the opportunity to get out of the apartment and to meet people, to meet real people. And Arnold has an interesting take. Take a listen.
Sometimes it helps to be around others.
I will. But for right now, I'm just looking forward to being by myself.
Aw, Arnold.
I imagine that this is probably true of someone like you mentioned earlier, someone who might be schizophrenic, who probably just wants to be alone and not tortured by constant visions and voices.
Well, yes, to the degree that you want to try to minimize those experiences.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that what the landlord says is actually very true.
Yeah.
In order for him to recover, he really does need a support system, and he needs to not be by himself.
Yeah.
It made me a little bit sad. And the music was like Hobbit music.
It wasn't Hobbit music. It was very hopeful. I appreciate. And I might be a little saddened because I have not seen the episodes going forward. I don't know if we ever see Arnold Wesker again. But part of me would really like to come back to Wayne Enterprises occasionally and see Arnold in the mailroom, or, hi, Mr. Wayne, just
right.
Doing well.
Just functioning.
Hi, Arnold. I would like to see that. I'd like to see the two of them shake hands where Bruce doesn't have to then wipe the sweat off his palm because Arnold was perspiring as he nervously shook his hand. It'd be nice to see Arnold progress beyond this character.
I agree.
I don't know that we're going to see that, but Drea, ultimately, we've talked a lot about Arnold and his progress. What was your take? What was that one thing that you wanted to really focus on in this episode?
Well, we certainly have addressed the idea of multiple personalities, and I think that we've spent previous episodes really nailing that down and describing those distinctions and kind of providing evidence for some other likely explanations for the Scarface figure in the ventriloquist's life. So we don't have to repeat that.
Right.
But I think what came to mind for me was the idea of triggers. And I was very impressed and kind of inspired by the way that Arnold was experiencing triggers and dealt with them, and how, again, in the beginning of this episode, how he was navigating his world throughout his recovery, and how great it was to see someone come out of a treatment center and still be struggling, because I think that's probably more realistic.
Right.
So something that I wanted to briefly touch on was the concept of the trigger. And of course, I'm going to talk about my favorite thing, which is the trigger warning and what that is.
You
and
love
what it's not.
trigger warnings, right?
I love it. Just kidding. I hate it. So just to kind of start from the beginning, a trigger from the perspective of a general construct is any kind of contributor to a symptom, a sensation, or a state. So, for instance, caffeine can trigger anxiety.
Okay.
Right? Like, it doesn't have to necessarily be about trauma. It doesn't have to necessarily be about distress, but that is essentially a contributor. Now, a trauma trigger is more specific. That is an experience that causes someone to recall a previous traumatic memory. So I want to be very clear on that. The trigger is essentially bringing back a memory. And the trigger itself doesn't have to be frightening or necessarily linked in or a clear remnant or reminiscent of an earlier trauma or the origin of the trigger. I can give you some examples of that because that sounds very vague. A trigger, for instance, a more obvious trigger. Let me use a straightforward example of, let's say, a young child experiences abuse from a redheaded man.
Yeah, let's go ahead and use that
Let's
example.
just say that's the random example.
It's a natural thing to just to assume. Yeah,
it's very possible that redheaded males could be a trigger for that individual because those are the characteristics that resemble the perpetrator.
Okay.
But that isn't necessarily how things turn out in real life. What's very common is that there is a sign or even just a small detail that can trigger a trauma memory. One that comes to mind for me early on when I started practicing were triggers around scent and odors.
Okay.
And so one example that I can tell you with de-identifying the person the best I can is that a woman was seeing me for extreme OCD symptoms, some of the more kind of common excessive washing, cleaning, very extreme behaviors like that. And what was prompting or contributing to that behavior was the smell of cigarette smoke.
Okay.
And it took some time to make that association. And then as we really talked about the scent of a cigarette, it was revealed to me over some consideration and certainly a lot of work and realization from the patient that she experienced some traumatic events with an abuser who happened to smoke. So what was initially kind of a small detail ended up being a really, really prominent, very significant trigger for her.
Right.
And one that she didn't really recognize early on as a trauma trigger.
Interesting.
And there are other things too, there are odors, there are scents, there are also visual things that can activate those memories. The senses are usually identified as the most common types of triggers. Like I said, sight and sound, followed by touch and smell. And the combination of those senses can be more powerful. And as I said, triggers are very diverse and very personal. And like we saw with Arnold Wesker in the beginning of this episode, triggers can bring back memories of the trauma and also cause some intense emotional and physiological reactions like rapid heart rate, sweating, muscle tension, ruminations. And these memories and feelings are really unpleasant, which is why a lot of people who experience triggers want to avoid them. I think that's sort of a natural response, right? Avoiding things that make you uncomfortable is normal. And in the short run, we feel better. But in the long run, the avoidance actually makes things worse because you're not learning through the experience of the trigger and the memory of the trauma that you can survive the experience. So I want to really just emphasize that what was harmful and what was destructive was the actual event, but a memory of something,
right? The
images, the feelings, those things are not harmful to us.
So you're saying that people who are troubled by trigger warnings are actually, in some cases, maybe doing more harm than good.
Okay, so let's talk about the trigger warning, because that's different than a trigger, right? So we're clear on what a trigger is, and just like, well, similar to the word trauma, a trigger in the general sense is a commonplace thing, whereas a trauma trigger is something more specific to a memory of a traumatic event. Now, a trigger warning is something very specific to audio content, publication content, websites, social media, those types of things, where there's a statement at the beginning of the piece of writing or video or blog alerting the reader or the viewer to the fact that it contains potentially distressing material. And this is often used to introduce the description of the content. So for example, in the beginning of a video or in the beginning of a post, there's a trigger warning that this deals with grief, this deals with sexual assault, this deals with violence, so forth.
Right.
And I don't dislike a warning about content. I dislike the use of the word trigger, and I dislike the idea that a majority of readers are unable to moderate their own emotional state and experience a publication with without that. I think that most people, even those who've experienced trauma, are able to handle it. And I want to be very sensitive to the fact that some individuals do struggle especially with video content. And so I do believe, especially with video content, that it's important to have some kind of content warning. This video includes, oh my gosh, for me, it's animal abuse. And I get very upset when people post things like on Facebook and there's a video or images of animal abuse, and I did not know that was coming.
Right.
I would not call that a trigger. I would call it something that's very distressing to me and something I do not want to see.
Sure.
And so there's a difference. And I think that when you have news headlines and publications that title their content in a way that's accurate, in a way that's sensible, in a way that's informative, you no longer need a trigger warning. So if my article is about suicide and that's in the title, I don't need a trigger warning.
It's about
in that writing, because that's what you know what it's about.
Right.
I think there are some.
If anything, the trigger warning should come before the headline. By the way, this headline is going to mention.
Yeah. I mean, we could go down that rabbit hole, but I want to be very sensitive to the idea that those are different things. Mm-hmm. That a true trigger warning would be specific to the population that suffers with trauma triggers. Yeah. And I don't want to discount that. I think that's a significant amount of people, and I think it's important to do that. But I also am just wary and uncomfortable with the overuse of the trigger warning.
Understood.
Should this podcast episode have had a trigger warning?
No.
Okay. So what did you think of the episode?
I really enjoyed it. Something that I actually really enjoyed, being a fan of cinema. I don't know if you picked up on this. I don't know if you even know who these two people are, but the voice actress that did the voice of the land
hips
lady. the hips, yes, but specifically the manager of Arnold Wesker's apartment, the landlady, also played by a little person by the name of Patty Maloney. Famous little person. If you were ever familiar with the Little Rascals,
yes.
From way back in the day, she played Darla. If you, Drea, you would absolutely know her, sort of. She was the little person inside of Lumpy, the Wookiee.
Oh, yes.
Chewbacca's son in the Star Wars Holiday Special. She did a lot of stuff. I, of course, remember her as the waitress robot. What was her name? Tina in an episode of Buck Rogers when I was growing up.
Wasn't Buck Rogers' horse named Trigger?
That is Roy Rogers.
Oh.
And Buck.
Trigger warning. Roy
Yes.
Rogers' horse was
Buck Rogers
Trigger.
was in the 25th century. He was a man from our time who ended up in the 25th century with Aaron Gray and Tweaky the robot. Beady.
Oh, that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Come on, man.
That was before my time.
Ugh, it was right smack dab in the middle of the best time ever for me. So she is a real little person that they cast to voice a little person in the episode. The other little person in the episode, Hips McManus, was cast by probably one of the most famous of little people, and that was Billy Barty. In a ton of movies. A lot of people, most recently, you probably remember him as Gwildor in Masters of the Universe, the live action He-Man movie.
Right.
But the moment you hear Billy Barty's voice, you instantly recognize it if you know who Billy Barty is. I just thought it was interesting that in animation, they cast two famous little people to play little people. And that was interesting to me, being a fan of cinema. Our old friend Leia asks, I have returned, and I have brought observations with me. Not that Mr. Wesker's struggle isn't heartbreaking to watch, but I would like to bring our attention to Bruce for one simple reason. He might have been trying to learn from his past mistakes. In this episode, Batman makes it a good point to tell Muggsy and Rhino with his fists to stay away from Arnold. It ultimately does nothing given the circumstances, but that's beside the point. Sounds to me like Bruce is trying to somewhat repent for his attitude toward Oswald in Birds of a Feather. Ooh, similar to what I was saying.
Yeah.
I am wondering if either of you picked up on this or even see the situation as such. Quick side note, am I the only one noticing that people named Arnold/Arnie that exist in the Batman the Animated Series / the new Batman Adventures universe continuously get trampled on? Just looking back to It's Never Too Late. Yeah, I mean, just like redheads, Arnold, Arnie, those folks treated poorly. For sure. No, you're not the only one that picked up on it. I think you're absolutely right. I think Batman should spend a little more time as Bruce and be a little more philanthropic and spend time nurturing people and watching out for them instead of watching and waiting for them to fail.
I agree. I think that he sees Arnold as still too vulnerable and susceptible to the potential threats, like the thugs, like the more. I don't want to create this dichotomy, but they present the thugs as more about just violence and crime and selfishness, and not about the struggle that Arnold's experiencing, right? Because we know that Arnold is into some antisocial behavior, that he's got his dummy, his personality there to engage in some of those things that are unethical or illegal and antisocial. So he's got it. But I think that there's this distinction made here, and that Batman is more, I guess, he's more sympathetic toward Arnold and really has no understanding or sympathy for the other characters there that are basically doing the same thing that Arnold was doing.
But let me bring this point up. Batman appears to more often than not be more sympathetic toward the sidekick characters. And I would argue that Arnold Wesker is the sidekick to Scarface, even though they're technically the same person. He treats him more like the dummy who's going to get kicked around. Batman treats Arnold like the victim. Like, I want to help you. He did the same thing with Harley. Like in Harley's Holiday, he actively encouraged her and treated her like someone who wasn't necessarily a criminal. Like when he saw her in the store, he didn't treat her like someone that he needed to watch with his binoculars in her shrubbery, like he did Pamela Isley. So I would say that he tends to be a little more lenient toward those he may have seen as victims or sidekicks than he would, say, Oswald or the Riddler or the Joker, or, Two-Face gets a pass because it's Harvey. But the masterminds are the ones who have a tendency to be on his radar as potential suspects forever.
Well, that's why this writing is so good, because the Batman this is a subversive thing. Batman is violating all the laws of superhero writing, like who's good and who's bad, evil, like all of that is really turned on its head. It's really about gradations. It's really about a more complex understanding of why people do what they do.
Yeah. It was great. I loved it.
Good stuff. Thank you, Leah.
Yeah.
Oh, I also want to thank a lot of folks who reached out to us over the last couple weeks and sent us some really great, positive, supportive notes. Folks who are also sending us stuff on IMSI and just some of the really just the thanks and the support we're getting. I really appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely. And speaking of IMSI, Drea, where can folks find you online?
I'm on Twitter at Arkham Asylum Doc. I'm also on a website /blog under themaskonline.com.
That is true.
I have another podcast that I do once in a while, and that is Lattes with Leia.
Yeah, which got some high accolades, was put on a list of top geeky podcasts of 2016. Congratulations to you and Amy Radcliffe.
Thank you. And you can find that on iTunes, or you can go check it out on Twitter at Lattes with Leia.
Now, if you're going to iTunes, though, you should know that you're going to subscribe to Coffee with Kenobi. And
Correct.
Once a month, Lattes with Leia takes that spot.
That's
so don't go
correct.
looking for Lattes with Leia on iTunes. But yeah, go check that out for sure. You can find me on Twitter. I am at bward028. You can find us both. We are at Arkham Sessions. And like I said, email us arkhamsessions@gmail.com. You should follow our family at Fanbase Press. That is at fanbase_press. And check out their website, fanbasepress.com, for all the cool news and reviews and opinions and podcasts and their own comics. Until next,
and check out Quince, which should be,
I don't even know what that is.
It's an awesome comic book that Fanbase Press is releasing, and it should be available on Comixology.
Awesome. So check that out. Until next week, I am Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
And together we are
the Arkham Sessions.
Sayonara, chumps.